The transport vessel shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere of Zeta 9, its hull groaning under the stress of entry. Inside, Commander Eli Vance sat strapped into his seat, his gaze fixed on the viewport as fiery streaks of orange and red blurred past. The planet was a vibrant swirl of colors, but beneath its atmosphere, a brutal war raged, silent and unseen from space. Eli was a veteran of interstellar conflicts, his features hardened by years of combat across the galaxy. He had been hired to assist the Tellurians, a species whose slender, delicate forms and wide, luminescent eyes spoke of their peaceful nature rather than any martial prowess. As the ship descended towards the colony, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Commander Vance, we're approaching the LZ. Intel reports increased Krivac activity in the sector. We're to expect a hot drop." Eli merely nodded, checking his gear as he prepared to disembark. His reputation as a formidable soldier had preceded him, earning him this contract on Zeta 9, a planet now more a battlefield than a home to the frightened Tellurians. The landing zone was a hastily fortified outpost on the outskirts of the colony's capital. As Eli stepped off the ramp, the air was punctuated by distant explosions and the dull roar of artillery fire. The ground trembled underfoot, a stark reminder of the ongoing siege. Captain Lyria, the Tellurian commander of the outpost, met Eli as he arrived. Her skin shimmered with a subtle iridescence, a stark contrast to the drab, utilitarian armor she wore. "Commander Vance, we are grateful for your arrival," she said, her voice melodic yet tinged with anxiety. "The Krivac have intensified their assaults. We are struggling to hold the perimeter." Eli surveyed the base, noting the worn expressions of the Tellurian soldiers. They were not built for war, their bodies too frail, their senses too attuned to harmony and beauty, not the chaos of battle. "Show me to my quarters," he requested, his tone indicating that he wished no time to be wasted. His quarters were nothing more than a small, reinforced shelter, barely enough for a bed and personal effects. As night began to fall, the sounds of battle grew closer, the darkening sky lit intermittently by the flashes of explosions. Despite the dire circumstances, Eli proceeded to set up his space. He unpacked a small, worn photo of a green and peaceful Earth, propping it up against his belongings. Then, methodically, he prepared for bed, his actions deliberate, almost ritualistic. Captain Lyria watched in disbelief as Eli, having arranged his bed, simply lay down and pulled the rough blanket up to his chin. "Commander, aren't you going to check the defenses? The Krivac could attack at any." Eli interrupted her gently, "Captain, your sensors and alarms will let us know if the enemy approaches the perimeter. Tonight, you need to rest as well. Tomorrow will be a long day." But sleep was a stranger to the Tellurians that night. Instead, they whispered amongst themselves about the human who could find peace enough to sleep amidst a war that terrified them. Eli's calm was unsettling yet fascinating. As the night wore on, occasional tremors shook the outpost, a reminder of the enemy's relentless advance. Yet, inside his small quarters, Eli Vance slept soundly, his breath steady and even. Around him, the base remained vigilant, the tension palpable. But in the quiet solitude of his shelter, Eli was a silent testament to an unspoken truth he had learned over countless battles: fear could be a more formidable foe than any external enemy. And as the Tellurians would soon learn, sometimes the greatest strength lay in the calm amidst the storm. As night deepened on Zeta 9, the distant rumble of the Krivac artillery grew into a relentless thunder, shaking the very foundations of the outpost. Commander Eli Vance, however, lay undisturbed beneath his thin blanket, the occasional flicker of distant explosions casting ghostly shadows across his calm face. Outside, Captain Lyria paced nervously along the hastily erected barriers that formed the outpost's perimeter. Every soldier under her command was on high alert, their weapons trained on the dark horizon from which they expected an attack at any moment. The night air was thick with tension, and the acrid smell of ionized air from discharged energy weapons filled their nostrils. Suddenly, a bright flare lit up the sky, painting everything a stark, eerie white. The Krivac had launched a full-scale assault. Bursts of laser fire began to carve through the darkness as projectiles from the enemy's advanced artillery started raining down on the outpost shields, testing their limits. Captain Lyria activated her communicator, her voice crisp with command despite her fear. "All units, engage at will. Protect the core. We cannot let them breach the perimeter." Her eyes were wide, reflecting the fierce light of the battle. Tellurian soldiers, gripped by a primal fear yet driven by a deep-seated desire to protect their home, opened fire with everything they had. The night erupted into chaos, a cacophony of blasts and explosive retorts that could deafen the unshielded ear. Eli, meanwhile, remained in his bed, his breathing deep and even as if he were miles away from the war zone. His rest was not the sleep of ignorance or helplessness but the rest of a warrior who had faced death too many times to flinch at its approach. Inside the command center, tactical displays flickered with incoming data, showing the advancing Krivak forces pressing closer with a terrifying precision. The Tellurians, though less experienced in warfare, fought valiantly, their energy weapons casting brilliant arcs of light across the battlefield. They were outnumbered but not outmatched, their resolve hardened by the sight of their comrades standing firm. Back at Eli's quarters, a young Tellurian medic, Silra, hesitated at the door, her face etched with worry. She had been sent to check on the human, the stories of his fearlessness having spread like wildfire among the troops. Pushing the door open gently, she peered inside, her eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of the human sleeping peacefully. She wondered if Eli truly understood the stakes of the battle or if his heart was made of sterner stuff than any Tellurian's. Compelled by a mix of awe and concern, Silra approached Eli, reaching out to shake him awake. Before her fingers could brush his arm, Eli's eyes snapped open, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her step back. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice calm. Silra nodded, unable to hide her astonishment. "The Krivak are pressing hard on the eastern sector. We are holding, but just barely." Without a word, Eli swung his legs out of bed and stood, towering over the petite medic. He dressed quickly, slipping into his battle armor with practiced ease. His movements were fluid, each motion efficient and precise. Together, they left the quarters and headed towards the command center. As they walked, the ground vibrated underfoot with the impact of heavy ordnance. Eli's presence was reassuring, his stride confident and unshaken by the explosions that rocked the outpost. Upon entering the command center, Eli was met with a flurry of activity. Screens blinked with tactical readouts, and officers relayed orders with a frantic urgency. Captain Lyria turned to him, relief evident on her face. "Commander, we're holding the line, but just barely. Any later in?" Eli nodded, cutting her off. "Show me the weak points. We start there." His voice was a calm command, slicing through the panic like a knife. He studied the holographic map, his fingers tracing paths invisible to the less experienced eye. As the battle raged outside, Eli's strategies began to take shape, his mind already working through the myriad possibilities of counterattacks and feints. His calm was infectious, and soon the Tellurian officers found themselves steadied by his unyielding presence. The night wore on, a test of endurance and courage for the Tellurians, a mere continuation of a never-ending struggle for Eli. His leadership would soon prove indispensable, his tactics crucial. For though the night was long and fraught with danger, Eli Vance had brought with him more than just hope, he had brought the will to conquer fear itself. As dawn broke over Zeta 9, the faint light of its twin suns began to creep across the battered landscape, revealing the aftermath of the night's fierce skirmish. The ground was scorched, littered with debris from both Tellurian and Krivak weapons, but the outpost still stood, defiant and unbroken under Commander Eli Vance's guidance. Eli himself walked amongst the Tellurian soldiers, his tall figure slightly stooped to enter their makeshift tents and shelters. He checked on the wounded, offered quiet words of encouragement, and assessed the damage with a critical eye. His presence was a balm to the weary fighters, his unflappable demeanor and the story of his undisturbed sleep amidst chaos had spread rapidly, morphing into a legend that seemed to grow with every retelling. "Did you hear?" Commander Vance slept through the bombardment like it was just a breeze, one soldier whispered to another as they watched Eli approach. "I heard it was because he's seen battles on more than a dozen planets." They say nothing shakes him, the other replied, his voice a mix of admiration and disbelief. The rumors were not confined to the low ranks. In the command center, Captain Lyria and her staff spoke of Eli's strategies and his uncanny ability to wrest through tumult, theorizing about his past exploits and the battles he had weathered. They say during the siege of Falrax, he slept in a trench while the bombs fell, and when he awoke, he led the charge that broke the siege, an officer recounted, his eyes wide with respect. Eli, for his part, remained oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the stories swirling around him. His focus was solely on preparing for the next Krivak attack, which was surely coming. He spent the morning hours poring over satellite imagery and enemy movement patterns, occasionally stopping to explain his plans to Captain Lyria. As the day wore on, Eli decided it was time to bolster the outpost's morale further. He gathered the soldiers in the central yard, standing on a makeshift platform. The Tellurians crowded around, their eyes fixed on him, their whispers falling silent as he began to speak. "Listen up," Eli's voice carried across the assembly, clear and commanding. "Last night, we held our ground not because we have superior weapons or because we outnumbered the enemy, but because we have something they don't. We have the will to stand up against them, no matter the odds." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know many of you are scared. It's okay to be afraid. But don't let that fear control you. Use it. Let it make you sharper, more determined. If you need to, imagine that you can sleep through an attack because you know, like I do, that panicking won't change the outcome." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eli continued, "Tonight, we'll face them again. And we'll hold the line again. Not just because we must, but because we can. And when this is over, you'll tell stories of how you stood brave and unyielding. You'll be the legends." His speech had the desired effect. The soldiers cheered, their spirits lifted, their resolve hardened. Eli had turned his mythical calmness into a weapon as potent as any in their arsenal. As preparations for the night's defense began, Eli returned to his quarters for a brief rest. News of his speech and the legend of his fearless sleep had reached even the ears of the Tellurian High Command, who communicated their gratitude and awe through official channels. Captain Lyria watched Eli retreat to his quarters, her mind a mix of professional admiration and personal curiosity. She had seen many leaders, both Tellurian and alien, but none quite like him. His strength lay not just in his strategic mind or combat skills, but in his ability to instill courage in those who had none. By the time the sun set and the stars peeked out over Zeta 9, the outpost was not just a physical fortification. It was a bastion of renewed spirit and determination, a testament to the human commander who slept peacefully amid storms, teaching those around him the power of tranquility in the face of terror. The resurgence of spirit among the Tellurian forces was palpable throughout the day as they prepared for another night of combat. The outpost, once rife with fear, now thrummed with a determined energy, much of it radiating from the legend that was quickly becoming Commander Eli Vance. Eli spent the day moving from one defensive position to another, not only reviewing fortifications but also taking the time to speak with the soldiers, sharing advice and insights that were as much about mindset as they were about military tactics. Each word he spoke seemed to fortify their resolve, turning fear into focus. At the heart of his strategy was an unusual directive. He encouraged the Tellurians to engage in mental exercises that mirrored those he used himself to remain calm. Visualize the battlefield, not as a source of chaos, but as a chessboard, Eli instructed a group of young Tellurian cadets. Each move you anticipate, each countermove you plan, brings you one step closer to mastering the fear that tries to master you. His approach was unconventional, but effective. The Tellurians began to see the battle not as an overwhelming force but as a series of challenges they could meet and overcome. Eli's calmness, mythic in its proportions, inspired a new kind of warfare strategy that was as psychological as it was tactical. Meanwhile, Captain Lyria organized training sessions based on Eli's principles. These sessions included simulated encounters where soldiers practiced maintaining their calm, using biofeedback devices to monitor their stress levels and adjust their responses accordingly. It wasn't just about shooting straight, it was about remaining mentally unflappable amidst the cacophony of war. As the suns dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty plains of Zeta 9, Eli stood atop the command center, looking out over the outpost. The preparations for the night were complete, and a quiet confidence had replaced the frenetic activity of the day. He knew the Krivak would come, drawn by the same cycle of attack and counterattack that defines so much of interstellar conflict. Yet tonight, the Tellurians were not just waiting, they were ready. Eli's calm was contagious, spreading through the ranks like a soothing balm. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones not out of fear, but out of respect for the silence Eli maintained as a cloak of protection over his thoughts and strategies. His presence was a constant reminder that courage could be as silent as fear was loud. The night's battle began not with the sudden, overwhelming onslaught of previous encounters but with strategic probing attacks by the Krivak. It seemed they, too, had learned from the previous night's failures. But the Tellurians, guided by Eli's strategies, responded with a measured discipline that was new to them. They held their fire until they could do the most damage, conserved their energy shields, and communicated silently through hand signals and brief, encrypted comms bursts, just as Eli had trained them. Throughout the night, Eli moved among the Tellurian defenders, a shadowy figure whose very calm seemed to ward off the chaos of the battle. His strategy of maintaining mental discipline under fire was working. The soldiers were no longer reacting out of panic but responding with precision and thoughtfulness. By the time dawn approached, the Krivak had withdrawn, evidently frustrated by their inability to penetrate the outpost's defenses. The Tellurians, exhilarated by their success, found a new reverence for Eli. His methods had transformed their understanding of combat, turning what had once been a desperate struggle for survival into a demonstration of tactical superiority. Captain Lyria met with Eli as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold. "Your methods have changed us," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and awe. "You've taught us that the true battlefield is in the mind. And on that field, we are becoming unbeatable." Eli nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "The mind commands the body," he replied. "Win there, and you win everywhere." As the new day began, stories of the night's battle spread through the outpost, each retelling reinforcing the legend of the human who could sleep through war. But more importantly, these stories spoke of a commander who fought not just with weapons, but with wisdom, a wisdom that taught his soldiers to find strength not in fear, but in calm. As the suns of Zeta 9 ascended into a clear sky, the debris-strewn fields around the outpost bore witness to the fierce night battle that had been waged. But within the walls, a palpable shift had taken place among the Tellurian defenders. Where once there had been an air of desperation, there now flowed a current of quiet confidence, fueled by the teachings and tactics of Commander Eli Vance. The morning after their successful defense, Eli walked among the troops, his steps measured and his demeanor reflective of the calm he continually advocated. Each soldier he passed nodded with respect, their eyes reflecting not just the fatigue of battle but the spark of newfound belief in their capability to withstand the Krivak onslaught. "Commander," Captain Lyria approached Eli as he surveyed the perimeter defenses being reinforced. "Your strategies have not just held the enemy at bay, they have shifted the entire dynamic of this conflict. What is our next move?" Eli turned, his gaze sweeping the horizon before resting on her. "We've been reactive so far, responding to the Krivak's moves," he said thoughtfully. "It's time we take the initiative. We need to start thinking about offensive operations, to give them something to worry about instead of allowing them to regroup and come at us again." The captain nodded, her expression determined. "I'll gather the officers. We'll need a detailed plan." Throughout the day, Eli and the Tellurian command staff worked together to craft a new strategy, one that involved not just defending their position but actively disrupting the Krivak forces. They pored over maps and intelligence reports, identifying potential weak points in the enemy's logistics and supply lines. The atmosphere in the command center was charged with a proactive energy, a stark contrast to the reactive scrambling that had characterized the early days of the siege. By late afternoon, a plan was in place. Eli proposed a series of hit-and-run attacks on the Krivak supply convoys, designed to sap the enemy's resources and morale. Additionally, they planned to use misinformation and psychological warfare to further destabilize the invaders, spreading rumors of a massive Tellurian reinforcement convoy approaching from another sector. That night, under the cover of darkness, small teams of Tellurian soldiers, led by their most elite units and guided by Eli's calm strategizing, moved out from the outpost. They were like shadows moving through the barren landscapes, their movements a whisper against the backdrop of a still and silent night. The raids were a resounding success. The Krivak convoys, caught completely off guard, suffered heavy losses. Supplies intended for the front lines were destroyed or captured, and messages of an impending large-scale attack caused confusion and fear within the Krivak ranks. Back at the outpost, the mood was one of celebration mixed with a kind of awe. Stories of the night's raids spread quickly, tales of bravery and cunning that seemed to grow in the telling. At the heart of every story was Eli, the human commander whose unshakable calm under pressure had become their most potent weapon. The impact of these operations on the Krivak was palpable. Within days, the frequency and intensity of their attacks diminished significantly as they were forced to divert resources to guard their supply lines and to counter the false intelligence they had received. This gave the Tellurians much-needed respite and time to further strengthen their defenses. Eli knew that this was just the beginning. Each successful operation built more than just tactical advantage, it built belief. Belief in their cause, belief in their ability to win, and, most importantly, belief in themselves. Under his guidance, the soldiers of Zeta 9 were no longer mere defenders of their home, they were its champions. As the sun set once again over Zeta 9, Eli stood on the walls of the outpost, watching the horizon darken into twilight. Beside him, Captain Lyria looked out across the landscape, her eyes not just watching but seeing a future where her people were no longer hunted but were hunters in their own right. "We are turning the tide," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of certainty. "Keep the pressure on, and the Krivak will have no choice but to negotiate or retreat." Captain Lyria turned to him, her expression one of deep respect mixed with a fierce pride. "With you leading us, Commander, I believe we will not just survive this war, we will win it." Together, they watched the stars begin to appear, each one a silent witness to the changing fortunes of Zeta 9, a planet and people transformed by the calm strength of one man. The Tellurian outpost on Zeta 9 was no longer just a bastion of desperate defenders, it had become a symbol of resilience and strategic brilliance under Commander Eli Vance's leadership. The previous successes had not only diminished Krivak aggression but had invigorated the Tellurian forces with a spirit of initiative and a belief in victory. The command center buzzed with activity as Captain Lyria and her officers planned the next phase of operations. Maps and screens covered every inch of available space, glowing with the flow of data and projections. Eli, ever calm and observant, stood apart, his eyes flicking between the screens and the faces of his team. "Eli, we've intercepted communications that suggest a significant buildup of Krivak forces in Sector 6, Captain Lyria reported, pointing to a blinking area on the map. "It looks like they're preparing for a major offensive." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "They're trying to reclaim the initiative," he murmured. "We've hurt them, and now they're bringing in more resources. This isn't just a response, it's their last stand. They know that if they don't break us now, the continued raids will." The room grew tense as the weight of the moment settled on the shoulders of those present. Eli's next words were crucial, and he knew it. "We will meet their force with our own," he declared. "Prepare all units for a full-scale engagement. We won't just defend this time, we'll confront them head-on." As the Tellurians mobilized, Eli's strategy unfolded. He planned not merely to counter the upcoming assault but to use it as an opportunity to break the Krivak's will. His plan involved a feint to draw the bulk of the Krivak forces out of position, followed by a decisive strike at their now undermanned base of operations. The night before the expected Krivak offensive, the Tellurian forces took their positions. Eli visited each unit, speaking words of encouragement and steadying nerves with his unshakable presence. "Remember," he told them, "courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it." As dawn broke, the ground trembled under the march of Krivak troops, their heavy armor moving with a ponderous inevitability toward the Tellurian lines. From his command post, Eli watched the battlefield unfold, his mind coolly calculating as reports streamed in. The initial Krivak bombardment was intense, shaking the earth and lighting the sky with fire. But the Tellurians held firm, their energy shields humming as they absorbed the brunt of the assault. Then, at Eli's command, the Feint, a large contingent of Tellurian forces moved to engage, drawing the Krivak deeper into the sector. As the Krivak forces committed to their attack, Eli gave the signal. The main body of Tellurian troops, along with specially trained strike teams, surged forward in a swift, unexpected counterattack. They exploited the gaps in the Krivak lines, encircling and then decimating their forward units. The battle was brutal and direct, with both sides suffering losses. Yet, through it all, Eli remained a fixed point of calm in the storm, directing movements, reallocating resources, and keeping the lines of communication open. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, the tide turned decisively. The Krivak, realizing their position was untenable and their supply lines compromised, began a disorderly retreat. Eli pressed the advantage, pushing the Tellurians forward to harry the retreating enemy, capturing equipment and taking prisoners. The victory was celebrated throughout Zeta 9, not just as a military success but as a turning point in the war. Eli's tactics and leadership had not only repelled the Krivak but had also inflicted such a blow to their morale and capabilities that their threat was effectively neutralized. As the dust settled and the reports of the day's success were compiled, Eli and Captain Lyria stood once again atop the command center, looking out over a landscape marked by the scars of battle but unbroken in spirit. "We did more than survive today," Eli commented quietly, his voice reflective. "We showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and strategy can prevail." Captain Lyria nodded, her eyes bright with tears of relief and pride. "And you have taught us all how to find our courage, Commander. Zeta 9 is forever in your debt." As the celebrations continued below, Eli felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for the battle won but for the confidence and resilience he had helped build in a once timid people. They were no longer just survivors, they were victors, defenders of their home, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold with courage and calm. In the aftermath of their decisive victory, the landscape of Zeta 9 began to transform. The scars of war slowly healed, replaced by the bustle of rebuilding and the renewed hope of its inhabitants. The outpost, once a grim bastion of survival, now thrived as a beacon of resilience and innovation, its defenses robust and its people confident. Commander Eli Vance watched the transformation from the command center, which had itself been refurbished to better serve the needs of peace than the demands of war. His job was nearly done here, but his influence resonated in every structure that was rebuilt and in every strategy session that now focused on defense and diplomacy rather than combat. Captain Lyria approached Eli with a light step, her face reflecting the bright new world outside her command post. "Commander, the Krivak have requested a parley. They wish to discuss terms of surrender and a subsequent peace treaty." "It seems your tactics were too much for them," she said with a smile that spoke of deep respect and a hint of sadness at his impending departure. Eli nodded, his response measured as always. "It's a good end to a hard-fought campaign. Make sure the terms are fair but firm. We've earned our peace, but we must ensure it lasts." Plans for the negotiations went forward, with Eli advising but increasingly stepping back, allowing Lyria and her officers to take the lead. It was part of his final task, ensuring that Zeta 9 would not only survive without him but thrive. The peace talks were held at the newly established diplomatic hall, a symbol of the colony's hopes and dreams. Eli attended, not as a commander, but as an observer, his towering presence in the background a silent testament to the hard-earned peace being discussed at the tables. The Krivak delegation was somber, their demeanor reflecting the shift in power. They agreed to withdraw all forces from Zeta 9 and cease hostilities, provided that they could retain trade relations on favorable terms. The negotiations were tense but ultimately successful, with both sides conceding enough to forge a path forward. As the treaty was signed, cheers erupted not only in the diplomatic hall but throughout the colony. The war was officially over, and the future, once so uncertain, now held limitless possibilities. In the days that followed, celebrations filled the streets of Zeta 9. The people, both Tellurian and human, celebrated not only their survival but their victory and the peace it had brought. Eli was hailed as a hero, the stoic human who had slept through war and led them to peace. Yet, as the celebrations continued, Eli knew his time on Zeta 9 was drawing to a close. He took to wandering the colony, seeing the fruits of their labor, the schools reopening, markets bustling with trade, and families once again safe in their homes. On his last night, Captain Lyria and her staff organized a farewell dinner in his honor. The room was filled with those who had fought alongside him, learned from him, and been inspired by him. Speeches were made, stories were retold, and thanks were given, not just for what he had done but for what he had taught them all. When it was his turn to speak, Eli stood, his voice steady as ever. This victory was not mine, but ours. Remember, the strength of a people lies not in their ability to wage war, but in their capacity to forge peace. Maintain your calm, hold fast to your courage, and you will face any challenge with surety. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Eli Vance departed Zeta 9. He left quietly, as was his way, not seeking fanfare or prolonged goodbyes. The outpost that had once been a symbol of war was now a symbol of peace, and as Eli looked back one last time, he did so knowing he had changed this place forever, not with weapons, but with wisdom. As the ship carrying him away ascended into the morning sky, the people of Zeta 9 gathered to watch, their eyes not filled with sorrow, but with gratitude. Eli Vance, the human who had taught them the power of calm in the face of chaos, would be remembered not just as a warrior, but as a peacemaker, the architect of a peace that would last for generations to come.